I'm President Ulysses S. And you joined me today in the library, and I should like very much to reflect with you about a significant day very early in my administration where I narrowly averted financial disaster for the United States and quite possibly the rest of the world that could well have resulted in a worldwide depression. I'm speaking about Black Friday, September 24th of 1869, but I must needs back up a bit and tell you the situation as it was when I took office on March the 4th of 1869. The national debt was $2.8 billion. So that's up from $65 million in 1860. 65 million to 2.8 billion national debt because of the war and of the succeeding 4 years when we had not paid down the debt. There were $356 million in greenbacks in circulation. And greenbacks they're worthless pieces of paper that were printed beginning in 1863 under the Lincoln administration, simply to put more money into the economy for people to have money. They're not backed by specie, gold or silver, and people accept them as legal tender for debts. There is also some $156 million in fractional currency, many of those notes issued by banks for 10 cents, 5 cents, 25 cents, 50 cents. So you see how much currency that has little to no value that is out there. A staggering national debt. And many of our European vendors that sold us goods and services during the war are quite concerned they may not be paid. Indeed, there are many people that are crying for us to repudiate all debts that we accrued in the conduct of the war. Of course, I'm not going to do that. I am determined to pay our debt in full and get us back on a specie footing, either gold or silver or both. And the Democrats are wanting to support the farmer and the small businessman and to print more greenbacks, put more money in circulation, which is only going to lead to inflation, which will lead to a recession, which will lead to a depression, a financial disaster that is simply waiting to happen, and it will happen. But I'm holding firm on conservative fiscal policy, pull back in those greenbacks as they come in through circulation and destroy them, and to pay off our national debt, all of our debts contracted during the war in gold as they were contracted to be paid, and to buy government bonds and to sell surplus government gold periodically to keep the money supply stable. There are many, many items that must be juggled here to keep our economy on an even keel, not to mention paying the debts I've already elaborated upon. And gold was $130 per ounce. Now, John Sherman, General Sherman's brother, Senator John Sherman, shepherded through the Senate quickly a bill that was titled An Act to Strengthen Public Credit. It indeed is the first bill I actually signed as president on March the 18th of 69, which said we were going to pay all of those bond debts, people that had bought war bonds during the war, they would all be paid in gold. So that was a reassuring ripple in the financial world, both domestically and abroad. And I think it's significant that the first bill that I signed was one dealing with fiscal stability. I had appointed George Boutwell as my Treasury Secretary, a well-known businessman, very conservative man in his private life and in his fiscal policy. So we worked well together. He supported me in my cautious and conservative fiscal approach in paying our debts in gold or silver, and in reducing the national debt and in assuring our credit financial standing around the world to maintain it in a good or best status. Now, the problem came up when, well, it goes back to my inauguration, when Abel Rathbone Corbin, 61-year-old widower, his wife had died a few months before, met my oldest sister, Virginia, call her Jenny. She's 37 years old, pretty lady, very pretty blonde, but had never married. Abel Corbin courted her very quickly, and they married very quickly. I knew Corbin because he was a real estate agent and a promoter. In fact, he had sold me my house on I Street that I bought when I was in Washington City between the end of the war and my taking office. And he had moved to New York City by that time. So he and Jenny married. In fact, I gave her away as the oldest brother of the bride. I was very pleased that they'd married. I liked Abel Corbin. And Corbin, though, Abel, he was susceptible to influence. There are two other players on this stage. There's Jubilee Jim Fisk, who has bested Commodore Cornelius Vanderbilt and gained control of the Erie Railroad, which was quite a financial feat, 33 years old, and Jim Fisk, Jay Gould and Jim Fisk, Jubilee Jim and Jay Gould. And Gould was 32, he's a year younger than Fisk. They both grew up poor, north and upstate New York, both had made money. Fisk made his money running illegal cotton through my lines during the war and made a fortune, became a very wealthy man. And Fisk, Gould, as I had said, had gotten into the railroad business, and now he's the chief executive officer of the Erie Railroad. They're both scalawags, scoundrels, ne'er-do-wells, and they sensed the scheme that if they could find out when we were going to sell surplus federal gold, that they could drive the prices up, corner the market, get all the gold available if they had advance notice of when it was going to be sold and put in calls for it and so forth, and corner the market. Well, that would have been a disaster financially for the country and for the world. But they did several things. First of all, they went to Abel Corbin in New York City, where he was now living on 27th Street, 5-story townhouse, wonderful, beautiful home, very prosperous in appearance. And Jay Gould went by to visit with him and enlisted him in the effort to help us corner the gold market. He didn't tell Abel Corbin everything. He just wanted to be able to get us, as he said, he and Fisk, close to the president where they could talk to him about the sale of federal surplus gold. Inside trading information is what he wanted, and promised Abel riches if he'd get involved. And Corbin fell for it. So the next thing they did was to approach Horace Porter, and Gould offered to buy $500,000, $500,000 in gold shares in Horace's name. Horace would stand to make a fortune on the interest on that or the sale of it. But Porter, being the man he was, refused. Gould went ahead and did it anyway, sent him a telegram that said, "I've done it." Horace Porter immediately then sent a telegram back and said, "I have authorized no such transaction." So Porter was out of it. They also bought $250,000 in gold shares for my sister Jenny through Abel. He was well aware of it, and that would make a lot of money. They also went to my wife Julia and offered her half interest in that $250,000 in gold. But Julia wisely said no, although she did say she rather liked Mr. Gould, but she turned it down. So they've enlisted Abel Corbin. They've tried to get Horace Porter. They tried to get my wife involved, and she turned them down. The next thing they did was they bought controlling interest in the 10th National Bank, which is near Wall Street, where much gold trading was dealt with, and they got controlling interest. So as their scheme developed, they would be able to put all their orders and sales through the 10th National Bank, which I should tell you was also under investigation by federal auditors for irregularities when they bought the controlling interest. As you might think, this doesn't sound well, but no one's putting together all the pieces. They they knew Boutwell couldn't be approached, I should say it that way. Boutwell was a straight arrow and they knew it, so that's why they tried to get to Corbin, to Horace Porter, to Julia, but they found the weak link in the chain in General Daniel Butterfield, who had been appointed sub-treasurer in New York City, where all of this gold transaction takes place. Jay Gould paid Dan Butterfield a visit and gave him a $10,000 check. Now, this is to a man whose salary for a year is $8,000. And they gave him Gould gave him a $10,000 check, no interest, no requirement to pay it back. And in the resulting investigation by Congress the next year, Dan Butterfield termed it a real estate loan. But they've got Butterfield in, and he too fell in, as did Abel Corbin. And they were hoping that Butterfield would give them advance notice when there was going to be a federal sale. They also bought later on they bought $1.5 million of gold shares for Corbin and Butterfield each. And every dollar in the rise per ounce of the cost of gold made each of them $15,000. Gold, as I said, was selling when I took office for $130 an ounce. It got up to 160 7/8 before this bubble burst. But every dollar in the per ounce cost that went up, they both got $15,000. And for reference, that would be $230,000 in later money. So they stood to become very rich men. Well, the scheme would reap huge profits for Gould and Fisk if they cornered all the gold, essentially most of the gold in the world. They could name the price. Then they'd sell it off at a huge profit. But that would hurt our customs offices because they're from trade overseas. They're paid in gold. The value of government bonds would plummet. It would devalue the greenback, which is already virtually worthless. And it would pretty much close down banks, small businesses, because there would be no gold changing hands, no way to do business. And farmers would die on the vine, so to speak, because they couldn't get money either, and our creditors around the world couldn't get their money, so the dominoes would begin to fall. This would result if Gould and Fisk had been successful. Well, every time I visited my sister in the summer of 1869, which was several times, Corbin managed to get, at first I wondered, how is it that every time I visit her, there is either Fisk or Gould there telling me about business and how we need to help the farmer. They really emphasized that and wanted me to tell them what I was going to do about gold and gold sales. I told them every time, I'm not telling you anything. That would be unfair. But they still pressured me. But then it all began to unravel on September the 12th. Now, I was leaving on vacation in western Pennsylvania, and I felt something was afoot in the financial world. I knew somebody is scheming. The gold sales are going up. per ounce. It's up to $135, $140 per ounce, and it's being artificially driven up because there's no change in business in the country. There's only the rising cost of gold because of the demand. And we're selling our government gold, the surplus, and buying some bonds, retiring greenbacks. In fact, by the 1st of September, Boutwell and I had reduced the national debt by $50 million. And that's from my taking office March 4th to the 1st of September, a $50 million reduction in the national debt. So we were doing well on course. But I knew something was wrong. I couldn't figure out who or where, but I knew to look for it. I left a letter for George Boutwell, who was going to be coming to New York City. And in the letter, I told him, hold steady, something's going on, but we'll figure it out. Stay on course. I sealed the envelope and I gave it to Abel Corbin, my brother-in-law, who was to give it to Dan Butterfield, who was to give it to George Boutwell when he came in town 2 or 3 days later. Well, I left and went to Western Pennsylvania. Abel Corbin begins to panic. He thinks that letter says, I'm telling George Boutwell to stop the sale of gold and everything will be over. He told Jay Gould this. And Gould says, don't worry about it. Didn't bother him. He was protected. But he told Abel, I'll buy you out for $100,000 if you want out. Corbin did. And so the next day, Gould keeps right on buying gold. He's protected, and besides, he could stand the loss if it all went awry. And then he also, though, when Abel told him he thought that I was onto them, he made Abel Corbin write a letter to me, a long rambling letter, telling me the virtues of selling the gold and letting them know when they're going to sell it. Just rambled on and on. It bored me. And Gould sent it by a special messenger, Billy Chapin. Always remember his name. And Chapin he took the Erie Railroad, he took a horse, he took a carriage. It took him a day and a half of steady travel to get to me. I was playing lawn croquet with Horace Porter, and he interrupted the game and gave me this letter that Abel had written me, and I thought, why is this? And Porter came in. Horace and I were talking. Porter was puzzled and asked me the conditions. I said, fella came to me and been traveling for a day and a half. And Porter said, why would he go to all that trouble just to give you a letter from Abel Corbin? And then he said, but you should know, this makes me think. And he told me about Gould offering him $500,000 in gold shares. And that's when I put it together. Gould and Fisk and my brother-in-law Abel Corbin were in league. They were the ones who were buying up the gold and artificially increasing the cost of gold and jeopardizing our entire national economy. So I went back, I went back to Washington, but when the messenger left me, he telegraphed to Jay Gould that message delivered, all right. The telegraph operator who picked up the message between Pennsylvania, Philadelphia, and New York put the message delivered, period, all right, 2 separate words. Gould interpreted that as being, I agreed with what my brother-in-law, Abel Corbin, was telling me, and that we would do what they wanted us to do. And he really began the buying of the gold shares. Then the price began to soar after that. Unfortunate punctuation. I got back to Washington on Wednesday, September 22nd, and Gould and Fisk on that day had between 50 and 60 million dollars in gold in possession, another 100 million on calls. In fact, they had more gold in their possession. They had 3 times as much gold in their possession as the government had in depositories in New York City. And on September the 22nd, they made $1.75 million on the possession of their gold and interest and so forth. I'm back in Washington. That's Wednesday. On Thursday, September 23rd, George Boutwell came to me, told me what he thought was happening. I told him about Horace Porter and my talk, The Messenger, and he said, ask, what do you want to do? And I said, watch the market tomorrow. If it goes up precipitately, we will sell gold and buy bonds. The next day, by 11 o'clock, the price of gold was up to $160.78. And he came back to the executive mansion from Treasury Department, told me what was happening, and I said, sell. How much? And he said, how much do you want to sell? I asked him. He said, $3 million. And I said, I think you should sell 5. He compromised, so he goes back to the Treasury, telegraphed via the Associated Press, open telegraph, that we were going tomorrow, which would be Saturday the 25th, be selling $4 million in federal surplus gold and buying $4 million in government bonds. The bottom fell out of the gold price because everybody knew in less than 24 hours there was going to be cheap gold. Hundreds of millions of dollars were lost. But Moses Grinnell, who was the customs officer for the Port of New York, sent a telegram to me that night that said, if you had not done what you did at noon, by 3 p.m., all the banks in New York City would have been closed, all business would have been closed. We would have gone over the precipice into the abyss economically, and the world would have suffered from it. So there was a recession. Farmers suffered terribly out west, particularly. We had a serious recession for a few years, but we finally recovered. It was much better than what would have happened if we had not done what we did. And Jubilee Jim, well, first Jay Gould lived for many years after that. Jim Fisk was killed January the 6th of 1872. A jealous lover murdered him. George Boutwell went on to become a United States Senator. And we weathered the recession and came out of it on the other side in fairly good condition. So that's why Black Friday was called Black Friday. My ability to handle the national economy was seriously questioned, but I think when the story is known as I have related it, that question will be cleared up and hopefully the cloud removed. But that's the story and my reflections on Black Friday, September the 24th, 1869. So for the moment, I should bring our visit to an end. I'm President Ulysses S. Grant in the library, and this has been a President Grant Reflection.